This is how startup founders usually think about their shares. And it's wrong. That's not how it works at all. But that percentage of the company, that chunk of the pie, is important. It's what matters for control and voting rights and for profit sharing and to figure out what you get if you sell the company, isn't it? Not really. Companies don't really work like pies. Bricks would be a much better way to represent a company, but it's just a lot harder to grasp. But if you're building a startup, or if you're looking for investors, or if you're giving equity to your employees, this is gonna be part of your daily life. And getting it wrong can get really expensive. So let me show you how it works. This is our new series, Startups Explained. Okay, so pies versus bricks. LLCs are pies. An LLC, limited liability corporation, is a partnership, and it's usually split in percentages, but that makes it really hard to bring multiple rounds of investors. So most startups are C corporations, and those are bricks. And so here's a 1-minute explainer in case you're in a hurry or in case 1-minute videos take over the world.
Why don't you explain this to me like I am an 8-year-old?
This is what startup founders imagine when they think of their share of their startup. But in reality, startup equity looks more like this. Let me explain. If Walt and Jesse get together to build, I don't know, a math lab, and they want to split this equally, they'll each get 10 shares, 50-50. Walt's shares will never change hands or be sold to investors, nor will Jesse's. And if they ever decide to bring an investor to their startup, what will happen is the company will create new shares for them. Walt will still have 10 shares, Jesse will still have 10 shares, and the new investors will get the new shares in their name. And by doing that, the company's total shares will change. Walt's 10 shares will no longer be 50% of the total. So the percentages have changed, but not the shares that each one of them owns. Now, how many shares does the investor get? For that, we need to talk about valuations. Startup valuations are a mess, and they're probably the most confusing part of this whole deal. For example, Adam Neumann, the founder of WeWork, raised $350 million for his stealth startup on a $1 billion valuation, which sounds made up, but it's not. And we made a whole video about it, but let's look at a less crazy scenario. When Mark Zuckerberg and Eduardo Saverin first started Facebook, they famously agreed on the 70-30 split on their founder equity. Those shares are called common shares, and we'll get to that in a sec. But then they brought in Peter Thiel as an investor who agreed to give them $500,000 for what would eventually become about 10% of the company.
Hey guys, come on back.
But remember, we're not dealing in percentages, we're dealing in shares. Now, this investment by Peter Thiel was meant to buy some shares from Facebook, shares that the company would issue for him. But how many of these OG Facebook shares do $500,000 buy? In a normal company valuation in the US, that's called a 409A valuation. That's the stuff that our team would look at to determine how much the company is worth. And in this case, a company with no revenue, just expenses, one could have said that this business is worth nothing. But you'd be wrong, of course, because Facebook today, objectively, is worth like $900 billion. So valuations relate to the future, right? To the potential of this company. But you still have to agree on what the company is worth now. So how do you go about that? How do company valuations work in startups? At its core, a startup valuation is like betting odds, agreeing on how much to risk and what reward to get if the investor is right. But a bunch of things come into play. In a startup, it's likely that more investors will come in the future, so the chunk of the pie left to founders needs to be enough to keep them motivated and working hard for years or decades to come. So going back to that Facebook case, Mark and Peter Thiel agreed that 10% of the company in exchange for $500,000 would be fair. So if $500,000 are 10% of the company, that means the entire company is worth $5 million. That's the post-money valuation because it assumes the money is already part of the business. But that also means that before the money came in, the business was valued at $4.5 million. That was the pre-money valuation. So now let's think of that in bricks. Let's assume that Mark and Eduardo and all the other guys who were part of Facebook had established the company with a total of 100 shares. Again, if the company is worth $4.5 million, then each share is worth $45,000. Peter Thiel's $500,000 would then be enough to buy about 11 shares of the business, which adds up to $495,000. So the company creates those shares and sells them to Peter. So we end up with 111 shares. Peter has 11 out of 111, which is about 9.9%. Also, for example, Eduardo's 30 shares got diluted. They're no longer 30% of the company. They are now 27% of the total. Now, I caught a lot of corners to make that explainer easy. In reality, Peter's investment was a convertible note, and we have a whole video explaining how those work. And also, since you can't divide a share in half, companies aren't established with 100 shares, but rather with 1 million shares or 10 million shares, each worth fractions of a dollar, so that it's much easier to split the equity. Also, Eduardo was famously screwed out of his own shares. I made a spreadsheet with the actual number of shares and the actual distribution of those shares through all these funding rounds, if you want to check it out. Now, you'll see that for the most part, the shares a founder or an employee got don't change through time, but as more shares get created, the percentage they represent gets smaller. That's very much the case for startup stock options. So let's talk about those. Now, in the startup world, it's quite common to offer stock options to key employees, especially during early stages of the business. The idea here is that these early employees are key to the success of the company. And since startups don't usually have a lot of money to pay them, these are people who are going to work really hard for a not so great salary.
It's more than I made last year after taxes.
Yeah, but we did an IPO last year, dude.
Now, stock options are a great way to compensate the extra effort and to reward them if the company does succeed. Now, you might think that stock options means giving employees shares of the business, and you'd be wrong about that. So how do they work? Let's take the example of an early Facebook. It just got its check from Peter Thiel. The company's valued at $5 million and now wants to give stock options to a new employee. Say the company gave that employee, say, 30,000 stocks, 30,000 shares, which would be just over 0.5% of the company. For tax purposes, that employee would be receiving an income worth about $27,000. And they would have to pay taxes on that, regardless of what happens to Facebook later. So instead, what happens is they get an option to buy it, a legal guarantee that says they can purchase those 30,000 shares at the current fair market price. That's called a strike price. When Facebook went public, price per share was $38 per share. So stock option owners would be able to buy them and then immediately sell them for $38. So our imaginary employee would have net $1.1 million. Stock options are a very useful compensation because they're only valuable if the company increases in value. If it doesn't, then they're not really worth it. In WeWork's case, for example, employees with stock options stood to make a fortune when the company was valued at $47 billion, but we know how that story ended. The last point I'll touch on is common versus preferred shares. A common share is a normal share, which usually entitles the owner to one vote out of the total number of shares and one share of the profits of the business. In our Facebook example, Mark and Eduardo had both common shares, but different investors might want other things or special treatment. So Mark famously retained more control of Facebook through the years because he was able to negotiate investor shares with non-voting rights. So if the share has an exception to a rule, if it doesn't behave normally, then it becomes a preferred share. Preferred shares might be better or worse than common shares, depending on its rules. And a company might have different generations of preferred shares with different rules stacked on top of each other, and it can get messy really quickly. Many investors, for example, want protections in case the company goes bankrupt. For example, when bankruptcy happens, the company has to liquidate, it has to sell everything it owns, and whatever money is left gets distributed between the shareholders. But liquidation preference would allow those shareholders to get their money back before other shareholders, maybe because they were the last to invest. Also, most shares can't be sold to third parties. Mark couldn't just go off and sell half his shares for profit. The rules usually require shareholders to offer them to existing shareholders first. Remember, you can't sell shares. Usually companies create new shares. Okay, so to recap, think blocks, not pies. Don't assume that shares are going to change hands. New shares are going to be created all the time. Valuations for fundraising are the odds for risk versus reward, which are not to be confused with official 409A valuations. Check out our video on convertible notes if you want to get a grip on how those work. Grab a free copy of our cap table template, which includes the Facebook case study on all the shares and what percentages and what stuff exchange hands. And for more Startups Explained, you want to hit that subscribe button and join our bi-weekly Startup Club newsletter. We'll see you next time.